So thanks very much for everybody coming along tonight to the second instalment of the Agile Roundabout. Special thanks to anybody who made the first one as well. For anybody who doesn't know me, my name is Phil Bateman. I'm the director of TRG, who is an agile recruiting business in software engineering. We've been going about 11 years, and we recently set up the Agile Roundabout to give something back to the community of the area that we work within. Today's speaker is Nigel Wilson of Scott Logic. Nigel and I have known each other for 10 years. We worked together for a very long time. He's going to be doing a talk on agile in regulated environments with Rob Newsom, who's the development manager at Scott Logic. If anybody could feel free to tweet about the event or post it on LinkedIn or take photos, that would be really appreciated. It's essentially your community. We would like as much exposure about it as possible. We want to make them as collaborative as possible moving forward. So hope you enjoy the talk. I'll pass it over to Nigel.
So what's the hashtag?
Agile Roundabout. And also maybe tag LendInvest as well, who kindly hosted tonight for us, so that would be great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Phil, for that introduction, and great to see so many of you here this evening. So thank you very much as well to LendInvest for hosting this event and providing such a wonderful facility. Great to have an office with a bar in. I wish I could have such an environment. So one for us to take away as a lesson learned, I think. So quick introductions then. Phil introduced himself. Nigel Wilson, I'm the General Manager at Scott Logic. You may not have heard of us before. We're a 200-strong consultancy based in London, Bristol, Newcastle and Edinburgh, and we're focused on delivering fantastic solutions for clients, mainly in capital markets and financial services. So we've got a bit of experience around kind of agile delivery in that environment, and wanted to share a few of that lessons learned this evening. My colleague Rob Newsom, who's Head of Development at Scott Logic, will also be speaking this evening, so that's the two of us. So, what are we going to do this evening? Well, we wanted to get together and share some of our thoughts and opinions. We're going to talk about what is the problem space that we're addressing, what do we mean by regulated environments in our kind of context, and how does Agile fit within that? You know, there's a bit of kind of juxtaposition there. Can you do Agile in kind of regulated environments? How does that work? What does that mean? And then I'm going to talk about some approaches to kind of getting compliance, and then how you might stay compliant within those kind of regulated environments. And then at that point, I'm going to, having done some theory, hand over to Rob, who actually knows how to do it, being our Head of Development, and he'll talk about some practical examples and some techniques and things that we've done in a little bit more detail. So that's kind of the structure, really. I should mention that we put this talk together specifically for Agile Roundabout. So on the plus side, this is an Agile Roundabout exclusive. On the downside, we haven't really polished it very much, so please go easy on us. Thank you. So, how do we define regulated environments within the context of what we're going to talk about this evening? So, I guess in essence, this is kind of any type of industry or any kind of delivery where you're getting requirements from outside of the organisation. So, typically in Agile, we talk about working closely with product owners and the business, and we're taking requirements from that perspective and working in that way. So within this particular problem space, then there are particular requirements that you have to meet as an organisation in the products and services that you are delivering, and those requirements aren't under your control, so they're coming from outside of the organisation. And we see that in a lot of work that we do, and actually you probably all see that in lots of work that you do. So there are obvious examples around regulated environments, things like finance, where you've got to comply with certain financial regulations, the business processes around trading and reporting and so forth. But there's also examples, for example, in healthcare, and things around medical devices and getting medical devices approved and the software that goes into that kind of sphere. one thing I've seen a lot of is obviously security accreditation, which, so you could argue that anything that's got that kind of accreditation on it is some kind of regulated environment. Is the microphone clipping out a little bit?
Yes.
We'll see how it goes, otherwise I'll put it down and just shout at you. And then also, of course, you've got things like data protection and privacy type requirements as well. So, actually for me, I was quite interested in doing this talk because although I've called it Agile in regulated environments, it kind of actually talks to Agile in the real world. I think generally when people talk about Agile delivery, we like to think about Agile delivery as a nice space that we can all sit and work happily with users and give them exactly what they want in terms of delivery. Sadly, often the real world kind of gets in the way, and other people kind of throw spanners in the works and throw things at you that you can't control. These are constraints that are outside of your kind of sphere of influence and things that you have to operate within. And to varying degrees, actually, pretty much everything we deliver as IT professionals has some element of this problem within it, really. So, you know, if you work in medical devices, if you work in financial services, you get extreme examples of this. But actually, we all find that we have this kind of problem to deal with, actually, no matter what kind of industry we're working in. Then how does that manifest itself? Well, it can manifest itself in two ways when we're kind of working on projects. It can be, here's some functional requirements that we've got to meet. So, in order to meet certain financial regulations, you've got to provide reports in a particular way. You've got to structure your business processes in particular ways in order to meet those kind of regulations requirements. But it can also be non-functional type requirements as well. So security accreditation being a good example where you might be doing, you know, pen testing of an application and making sure that you can meet those kind of compliance type requirements. And meeting those two types of requirements means working in slightly different ways in how you test and deal with those two things. So that's kind of my definition of regulated environments for the purposes of this talk. But I'll be interested to hear later from all of you kind of the environments that you work in and how that translates into your kind of day-to-day work. So what does that look like? Well, I put lots of words on before, so I thought I'd try and draw a picture. So basically, you know, typically in an organisation, what you want to do around Agile delivery is get Agile teams working closely with users and the product owner being the kind of expert in terms of facilitating that dialogue. But clearly, what we're dealing with in regulated environments is we have this kind of nasty character on the outside, this regulator who's kind of making us do things in terms of how we deliver products and services and that credit kind of the work that we do, and we've got to kind of manage the requirements that they impose on the organisation. So, how do we deal with that from an Agile perspective? Well, as you all know, kind of Agile encourages us to work in certain ways and leads us to want to work in certain ways. So, you know, you want empowered teams working very closely with a product owner. You want to focus on getting great software out there rather than worrying about the kind of process and worrying about the documentation and all the kind of bureaucracy that kind of limited us in kind of more traditional type waterfall life cycles. We want to be able to set priorities. So we don't want kind of be in the world of fixed dates and fixed scopes. We want to be able to kind of set priorities based on business value. We want to go, right, this is the thing that our customers really want. We're going to deliver this thing for our customers. This is going to generate great value for the business. That's what we want to do as Agile delivery people. And we want to kind of work in a way that's sustainable. So, you know, the team velocity sets the pace in which we deliver and the ability to kind of get things over the line. Now, I guess many of us would think that working in regulated environments that those things aren't possible because we've got this hard requirement, we can't negotiate about it, we just have to do it. And we have to do it by a particular date. And my experience of working, particularly in banking, where there's regulation, is actually you find the regulators much better at setting the date than they are telling what the requirement is, which can be quite a problem. So, you know, we've got to be compliant with this date, we've got to be compliant with this date, but what does that mean? What do we have to actually do? And there's also a perception, of course, to be compliant around something, you need to generate lots of evidence, lots of documentation, and lots of process around that. We're going to have to do this thing which is fixed scope, we're going to have to do it by fixed date. So you'd kind of naturally think that those things kind of cut against each other and it's not possible to be Agile. That said, I think, from my experience, Agile actually helps you solve this problem, because the alternative of not doing it Agile is to kind of try and meet these requirements in a waterfall way and have some big bang kind of compliance thing. So that gives you kind of the situation where we're going to get a nasty surprise at the end of the project. So we'll do all this work, we'll try and get compliance, then we'll run some checks and validate it, we'll pass it over to the regulation department, and they'll just rubber stamp it, it'll all be okay. But that kind of waterfall end game, kind of big bang approach to compliance is as scary as all hell really for all of us. What we want to do is kind of get there incrementally and use all the great stuff that Agile gives us to meet those compliance things. So that's kind of ideally what we would like to do. So from my perspective, is Agile an option? Yes, it is, and we've seen ways in which we can make that work. So how do we do that? What are some of the key themes? Well, in terms of getting compliance and running regulatory projects that seem like they can't possibly be Agile, how do we do that, and what's some of the key things? So what I wanted to introduce was, I guess, 5 key points from my perspective of what are the important things, what are the kind of things that we need to do in terms of making regulatory type projects work within Agile delivery. So the first of those is kind of something that you would generally do anyway in any project, but it's kind of what's the outcome. So having that kind of real strong results focus. So, what is the goal? What does that mean? What is actually compliance mean in the context of this? What's the end point that we're aiming for? And how do we understand what that is in terms of how we're going to know when we've got there? So what's the, like with any requirement, what's the acceptance criteria and how are we going to test it? And how do we incorporate that into our definition of done so that we can build to that point incrementally as we go for Agile delivery? So it sounds kind of quite obvious, but it's kind of like, where's the end point we're going? How do we get that into our roadmap? How do we get that into our backlog? How do we build that kind of compliance focus in to the Agile process? And I think very much the Agile process supports us in doing that. So the first thing for me is really having a focus on the end game. The second point, which might be a bit more controversial and counterintuitive, is to collaborate with the kind of accrediting body and the regulator. Now, you might think that this isn't possible and they're just kind of people on high with superpowers that can impose things on your organisation. That probably has been the case, but I think we've certainly seen in conversations we've had with our clients recently where the regulators are more willing to engage in dialogue and they want to kind of understand and help kind of organisations to work within the regulation. So I think there is a degree of how do you collaborate in terms of working within this space. How do you treat regulators and accreditors as a key stakeholder of your business, and how do you manage them in that way? I think is an incredibly important thing to do. And I've seen this, I've done a fair bit of work in public sector, for example, and security accreditation is a big thing there. How do you go about getting security accreditation? Well, you kind of work with the accreditor, you explain to them what you're doing, how are you going to get there, what are the steps to get there, how are you going to build this platform out, and how are we going to kind of get to the point where there's kind of no surprises and we're not just kind of trying to do some massive kind of waterfall endgame validation type exercise. I think the other thing is around making sure that the teams understand the intent behind the regulations. It's not just about we must obey these rules, but what are the rules intended to get to? And does that mean that there are alternative implementation approaches to getting there? And I think that's a dialogue that is well worth having. And then I think the other thing is trying to bring in that regulatory regime into kind of the regular Agile kind of rhythm that you've got. So how can we demonstrate incremental progress towards those goals that we're focused on? And that's a massively important thing to do so that, again, there's no surprises either for the delivery team or for the kind of accreditor or the regulatory body. So my third point here is how do you go about using a pattern? And this is something that Rob's going to pick apart in a little bit more detail in the second half of the talk. I think the key thing is, as I've already mentioned, is kind of avoiding that big bang at the end. So we want to get incremental delivery towards those goals, and that's what Agile supports us in. So this is why Agile actually I think is really well suited to this kind of problem, in that we can demonstrate that progress, we can use the sprint pattern to support that, we can get feedback, we can adjust our course, we're not going to worry about drifting off and not getting to the point where we're coming within the confinement of those constraints that we're getting. So very important to use that pattern. Now, clearly, in terms of meeting various compliance kind of constraints, often there is some kind of validation type process that you need to go through. Don't ever do that just once at the end of the project, do that repeatedly, do incremental releases to get there. In some cases that might be doing some kind of special release type sprint activity, but there's other ways of achieving that, and Rob's going to highlight some of those a little later. The other thing which is kind of interesting from my perspective is kind of very much, we'll kind of think typically about technology when it comes to delivery, and I think there's a broader piece to consider, which is actually the thing that needs to be compliant is your whole product or service. So I think it's important to take a full solution view. What that means in an agile context is that we can still potentially work through some prioritization type activities. And what we can do is look at flexing that boundary in terms of we've got to be compliant in terms of the full service, but that doesn't necessarily mean we've got to deliver all of that through tech necessarily. So we can look at, potentially analysing the frequency of different transactions within our system. We can automate the most popular ones. We can introduce manual workarounds for the ones that are less frequently visited. And we can use that as a method of becoming compliant without having to wait for the tech delivery. So I think it's worth bearing in mind, what is the full solution? What's the full product or service that's going to be accredited? And considering where that dividing line is between tech and kind of manual processes. The other thing I would say is that in terms of becoming compliant, you need to consider the business processes and all the stuff around the edges of the tech, and not just the tech, and try and use the same agile delivery pattern to influence that, as well as delivering tech, do the business change in parallel in the same pattern. And then finally, on the kind of the 5 points around getting compliant is around getting away from a kind of siloed mentality, which we've always done in Agile. So in the old days of waterfall delivery, when people had development and threw things over the wall into test, that created problems, as we know. And I'd argue the same is true for compliance and regulation, is if you're relying on your internal regulatory department to do the regulation activity as a step later on, then you're probably setting yourself up for a problem there. What you need to do is get that regulatory knowledge and input into the Scrum teams. Get that knowledge in there, make sure the team is familiar. Now, a lot of regulation will be quite deep and technical, so you're not going to know all the details, but I think there's a need to get that understanding within the Scrum team and build that in as a requirement from a key stakeholder without relying on a regulatory or compliance function within your organisation somewhere else, dealing with that separately at a later date. The other thing I think as well is, as we're all doing this evening, is finding out more about this kind of stuff. Regulation from an outside body affects not just you, but it affects everyone in the industry. So I think there's a great importance there in networking in the community, sharing ideas, and working out how other people are achieving that. I think that's an important point. So once we've gone through that struggle and maybe taken on board some of those approaches, how do we go about staying compliant? What's some of the key things you want to do going forward? So for me, there's three things here. One is, as you would expect, you're going to continue to involve your products and services. If you're evolving them and changing them, how do you stay compliant? Well, I think a regime of continual inspection built into the work you do in releasing changes as part of continuous delivery is incredibly important. Now, we'll have hopefully built up some type of compliance testing as we go through delivery. We'll be able to use that and build that into our regression testing and make sure that we kind of stay within the bounds of what's acceptable in terms of compliance with, be it the security requirements, whatever else it is. And once again, as I say, get it automated as part of your continuous delivery. Just so that we stay within that kind of compliance regime. Secondly, I think there's an opportunity to continue to learn and optimise and get feedback on that. So there's a number of things here really. It's kind of keeping up to date with what's going on. I think it's quite important to learn from not just what you're doing, but what others are doing in this regulatory environment. It would be quite interesting, I guess, once you've got your product or service out there and people are doing the same, what's coming up around non-compliance, because that might be an edge case that someone else has suffered from that you haven't tested for yet. You might want to. So I think it's kind of worth monitoring what's going on in that environment. And then, of course, keeping in contact with that kind of those third-party bodies as stakeholders and maintaining that relationship, so you're understanding kind of, yeah, is this actually meeting the intent that everyone intended? Have we over-engineered this? Can we actually refactor this and do it in a better way to meet the requirements going forward? So I don't think, you know, the kind of maybe older vision of kind of regulations, kind of like, right, it's a one-time thing, it stays static forever, we've implemented it, we're done. I think there's opportunities to learn and improve and refine that as we go forward. And then, of course, you always need to look to the future, and whatever product or service you're building, you'll have a roadmap for that, you'll have your product backlog, there's going to be other regulatory changes that are going to come along in the future. Where do they fit in your product backlog? Making sure those things are on that product backlog and you've catered for those things, and continuing to manage that relationship. So those are some of the things from my perspective that you want to kind of think about and focus on in terms of the ongoing developments of your product and service. I think I've rattled through my slides quite quickly, in which case I'll hand over to Rob. Thank you.
Hi everyone. So yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this. I suppose I'll refer back to some of the stuff Nigel talked about, and also I'll probably start off topic a little bit and talk about projects more generally perhaps. So I guess before kind of getting into some details, I just wanted to highlight something which I think is quite relevant here. So this is from the Scrum Guide, and the bit I've emboldened. Cross-functional teams have all competencies needed to accomplish the work without depending on others not part of the team. And I suppose just to illustrate some of the compromises you're likely to make, you know, in this kind of environment, this is quite a big one. Whilst you might have people to do, I guess, the primary development, you know, in your project, you're probably going to depend on a lot of other people. So I think the first thing to say is managing relationships is going to be super important. You know, the reality here, whether we're talking about complying with, you know, legal regulations in a particular industry, or security requirements in a client, or whatever, they're never black and white. You know, the regulations never come written down tailored to your project. So you know, you can't just rely on reading something and saying, okay, I'll apply that to my thing. I guess I'm kind of thinking of a couple of projects. So the one I was pretty involved in, where we had, well, actually the same client, two projects. One where we made a real effort to engage with the security team in this case, really up front, get to know them very well, you know, get them to understand how we were working, why we were working that way, you know, what we were trying to achieve, in their organisation, and really work with them so that their initial, you know, kind of a reaction of no, you can't do that, you can't release that often, you can't, you know, have that little oversight, actually turned over time to them trusting us. And being totally cool with how it wants to work. The other projects, similar, same client basically, took a slightly different view. They started by kind of ignoring the security guys and then trying to sidestep them a bit, and they got shut down pretty quickly. And ultimately had to go back and rebuild those relationships, and I guess now it's okay. But relationships are super important. Equally, I guess another thing I'm thinking of in energy trading, we work with a client in the Nordic regions, and their regulation is pretty, I guess, high level. It requires quite a lot of interpretation to get to what it actually means to you. The regulators there have been like super kind of up for talking about stuff. And I think, as Nigel said, you know, even you know, the FCA here. They, certainly from discussions with them, seem really up for talking with people and trying to get a bit closer to projects and actually understand what people are trying to do so they can encourage a bit more innovation rather than just saying no to stuff. And I think actually they're a bit worried that in-house compliance people might be saying no too often because they're taking a fairly conservative view. So yeah, if you take nothing else away, I think importance of relationships and managing stakeholders is super important. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how we've managed releases, because I guess, you know, release management and formality around release is a fairly important point in this kind of environment, and probably in lots of environments too. So I guess as you saw on Nigel's earlier slide, a common approach generally is to do releases every few sprints. I mean, perhaps before I get into that, I won't ask you any questions, but can you put your hand up if you work using Scrum or some other iterative kind of process? Keep your hand up if you release every 3 months. Keep your hand up if you release every month. Keep your hand up if you release at least every month. Keep your hand up if you release every sprint. Not many. Keep your hand up if you release more than once a sprint. Cool, well done. So I guess starting, I suppose at a high level, this is a pretty common approach. If you read, quite a lot of stuff around doing Agile with constraints like this, you kind of see this terminology of hardening sprints. So you build stuff, and then you do a release preparation sprint essentially. And I've seen this in lots of places when you didn't have anything particularly to do before a release. But when you do have things like, I'm zooming in a little bit, when you have particular testing or validation or paperwork you have to comply with, it's quite tempting to do that till the last minute. The downsides of this approach, I guess, are a few. One is it just takes a while between writing your code in that first sprint and releasing it at the end. It makes your velocity quite hard to predict because I suppose fundamentally you're leaving stuff until later on, and it's quite tempting when you leave a bit of stuff to later on to leave quite a lot of stuff to later on. So you end up, I found you end up kind of it's hard to predict what you haven't done because there's always a temptation to just leave it to the hardening sprint. And because you're not doing releases that often, when those delays do start to creep in, people get quite jumpy because there's not another release and you haven't done a release for a while. So that's quite a common approach, and that's I guess how a lot of us are working. And then certainly I've done sort of plenty of projects like this. We started a project a few years ago, I guess after coming from this kind of environment where really the sort of guiding principle at the start was we wanted to release really often. So we kind of ended up going for this kind of approach where we're releasing every sprint, but there was still some release preparation to do. It wasn't just a sort of finish on Friday and okay, cut the code, release the prod. So we ended up with a period of release prep, and here we're actually working on quite long sprints. It's quite a big project, so it's 4-week sprints with a probably 2-week release preparation window. And I've seen similar with 2-week sprints and perhaps a week release prep. And this gives you much shorter time from when you're starting the work to having it in production. It means that you're releasing much more frequently, which means that your stakeholders are going to be much calmer, because if you don't manage to release something, even worst case, that release goes totally wrong, they know there's going to be another one pretty soon afterwards. Of course, it's kind of easy to say this, and I guess I've done it in certain environments. Obviously, if you have stuff that's particularly onerous to do in the release prep time, it might be quite tricky to actually do that. But I think as a goal, it's pretty good. And then, I suppose looking beyond that, it's quite good to release every sprint, but it's better to release more often. And I guess these are some of the things that I've seen being pretty helpful moving towards continuous delivery. And I think actually independently they're quite valuable things, but they roughly in some order like this kind of help you speed up your releases. So the first thing is continuous integration. So it's kind of a prerequisite for continuous delivery. It allows everybody to make sure that what they're doing integrates with what everybody else is doing and see the results. That's probably uncontroversial. Second thing, automate deployments. Again, just solve something that's otherwise a bit of a pain in the ass. And if you're going to be releasing quite often, you want to make it as seamless as possible. The other thing, as a sort of an add-on to that, is make sure it's obvious what's running where. If you're releasing often, you want to know what you're testing, what's running where. The next one, automate regression testing. So obviously, there's plenty of tools for doing normal regression testing, particularly for, I guess, web applications, but lots of things. If you've got any sort of external validation, that's obviously quite tricky to kind of automate away. But in lots of cases you don't have that. And the more you can automate this, the easier it is to do releases, the less time it takes between having the code and it being ready for release. And it's just a less onerous thing to do. The next one, as I kind of said earlier, avoid release preparation sprints. When you have a release preparation sprint, there's a massive temptation to leave stuff until then. That always happens, and you always end up doing a little bit more because everybody wants to succeed, right? Everybody wants to do what be finished in the sprint. So it's quite tempting to leave it till later. It's also, to be more generous, it's actually quite hard to know when you're done if you're not having to demonstrate that. And the mechanism for doing that, I guess, I saw something that said, OK is doing something before release, better is to do it at the end of the sprint, best is to do it per work item. And the way you drive it to the work item is you update your definition of done, in Scrum at least, so that when any piece of work is done, it's then properly done and it's ready for release. And by doing that, you can really pull stuff forward from these release preparation sprints and from releases to when you're doing the work every day. I guess the obvious one is prioritize keeping things releasable. If you prioritize that over everything else, then you should stay releasable. Automate infrastructure is, I suppose, in a sense, a sort of optional one. Perhaps it's perfectly reasonable to do this stuff without having automated infrastructure. Without being able to recreate environments at will. You can have a fixed set of environments and move software through them. But it's really cool being able to just spin up an environment at will. If you want to do a particular bit of testing, just spin up an environment for it and get rid. Obviously, with cloud technology, it's quite easy to do that. But you do have to put a bit of investment into to actually do the automation. An interesting, I guess, aside for that, from a sort of regulatory point of view, I suppose I've worked in things where the sort of underlying technical infrastructure was accredited, and then we did deployments of that were sort of separately accredited. I've not really seen how many sort of regulatory regimes and security teams deal with constantly renewed software-defined infrastructure. Say, I guess you kind of got to have some trust that what you're recreating is going to be repeatable every time. But it's kind of interesting area, I think. So second to last point, improved monitoring. I say dramatically. I think this is something that's often ignored, and it's a super important thing. Things like the Elk stack make it possible to essentially record everything that happens in your system, and then you can just query for what you want afterwards. The other big thing I think with that is teams where you've used that tooling within development and test as well as production. You just get dramatically better ownership of those tools from the dev team, and that makes a massive difference. And I guess brings us to the sort of world of DevOps, where dev are really taking more of an interest in what's going on in the system. So I think improve monitoring dramatically and get the development team using it at all stages. So it's really good thing. And then lastly, I suppose I put it lastly because by the time you've done the other stuff, you can justify this a lot easier. Remove or streamline external change control. I saw I guess a bit of a rant from Jez Humble, who wrote a continuous delivery book on change control boards. Basically saying, an external board is very, very poorly placed to understand the risk of a release of your products. The team that built the products and that made those changes, they're the ones that understand how risky those changes are. So it's kind of ridiculous to ask an external board to give you a sort of go or no go decision. I think being perhaps slightly less harsh than that. Change control has an important role to play in sort of making sure you've done everything. So I think in this model you kind of should view it as a check for all the decisions. So you as the team, as a project, should come saying, we've done everything. We recommend this is a good release, and that that sort of change control mechanism, whatever it is really there to say yes, you've done everything. Go for it. So that's it's slightly inside, but I think those are some of the things you need to do to move towards a more continuous delivery model. And then just getting, I guess, further off topic. I just thought it'd be interesting to see some of the boards that this type of board that we've been using on projects very recently. So this is from I guess in this sort of format is from a sort of Scrum Run type project, which explains the sort of far left bit. But it stuff comes in, work that's ready, the product owner's kind of prioritised and is kind of understood at a fairly high level on the left. Goes to analysis, UX if needed. Then comes into the ready for development column. Devs pick it up, starting at the top. Once it's developed, that gets then moved into call it pull request here, the sort of a ready for review type thing. I think I guess another point I say code reviewing is like the #1 engineering practice I'd recommend. It essentially drives almost all other engineering practices. If you're doing code reviews of everything, then everything else will kind of come from that. And then it goes through testing, UAT, and obviously if you have other sort of regulated steps, you should sort of put those in as well. And yeah, I guess we'll talk about definition of done, what that actually means. And then I guess traceability is a fairly important thing in these kind of environments. So I suppose one thing is just you want to, usually in these kind of environments you want to be doing, working in a way that seems professional. And if someone comes and audits you, you can say yes, we did this and this and this flowed to this. This what was in that release. So having electronic records makes it easy. So you're probably not going to be working off a paper board on the wall. Makes some things easy. Obviously, you can have various levels of sort of openness of those tools. I've always been, I guess, pretty trusting. I think when it sort of becomes something you want to lock down a little more is when you do a release. So in terms of releasing, you want to be sure that when you have a release, you know exactly what's in it, and that nobody accidentally changes that later. So certainly, I guess a couple of things. One is the notion of a sealed release, and particularly if you're doing any sort of verification exercise, you want to be verifying the release that you're going to put out, and you want to make it very hard for anything to alter that release. So things like putting your binaries somewhere in like a binary repository that's permissioned appropriately, so not everybody can swap them, is probably a useful thing. And then having some permanent record of what was in that release that doesn't get broken if someone accidentally changes the release tagging, the version tagging in Jira for those activities. And then I'll come on to the sort of granularity of releasing shortly, but I guess there's two kind of models. You either release everything in the system, or you release little bits at a time, and just, I guess, understanding what you're releasing, what it depends on, and if you're accrediting a system, exactly what versions of stuff you're accrediting is a sort of a problem that needs some records to solve. And then lastly, I guess the most obvious traceability thing that comes up is tracing testing through to requirements. So I guess I'm thinking of a project we did recently where their starting point was, okay, so we want to have written test reports for every minor release that shows all the tests that were run, all the details of the test cases that were run. So a massive kind of Word document against all the requirements. And that was initially seen by the team to be quite an onerous thing. With a bit of chat with the people that were asking for that, and a bit of explanation about what we were trying to achieve, and the idea that we're automating quite a lot of stuff, actually it turned out to be essentially an extract of, essentially two things. One is a naming convention for automated tests, such that you can map tests to requirements. And I think something like that works okay if you have the code reviewing in, so that you don't make mistakes, or you don't make any more mistakes than you make writing a learning. And the second thing is then like an automated extract that could say for every release, okay, we run all this stuff, this is how it maps out to requirements. And you can take that further and produce extracts of the requirements and say these ones aren't tested, as far as you want to go. But I think that's a good example of sort of going back to people and saying, okay, that's what you've asked us to do. We don't want to do that, but here's what we could do instead. Really makes sense in having that dialogue. And then I guess the last topic I want to talk about is just architecture for systems where you have some sort of regulatory overhead. And so architecture diagram here. Sorry, it's just got boxes, not the boxes in lines. But imagine this is the system. the traditional approach to this, the easiest thing to do is to release everything together. You've got a load of components, you release it all together. I had a colleague who in a former life worked on a sort of online betting system basically. And for every new game they introduced, or every release of the game, they had a 2-week long test, which was a statistical test where essentially you drove it with lots and lots of traffic. And it was using like a hardware random number generator, so it took a while to do that. So it took 2 weeks to do. So doing that whenever you wanted to release any part of the system would have been super, super painful. So the kind of solution to that is to divide it up. So the things in blue are the things that are highly regulated. These things are the really big steps to release them. And those things you want to release individually, and you want to release not very often. And then everything else, and I'm trying to here release together, but you can essentially do whatever you want. And I guess moving to a more microservice world, you can release things independently anyway. But yeah, so separate those things and make sure you're not reaccrediting things you don't have to. I think that's probably a generally good thing for testing. If you're testing stuff you haven't changed, there might be an opportunity to make things easier for yourself by just releasing the things that have changed. And I think that's it. So I'll hand back to Nigel for a summary.
Thank you, Rob. Yes, I just wanted to quickly wrap up. So, I guess in summary, what's special about regulated environments? Well, for me, this is really kind of agile in the real world to a large extent. We've got constraints here that are outside of our control. We can't negotiate them away. We're going to have to meet them. And I think probably to a varying degree, we all face these kind of challenges, really. Can we use Agile to solve this problem? Absolutely we can, and I really believe that we should, because a lot of the tenets of Agile around incremental releases, around collaboration, around all of that kind of good things that we value, getting working software out there in front of stakeholders in Agile is absolutely applicable to this kind of problem and helps us solve this kind of problem. And I think, in terms of how we succeed in this environment, well, you need to develop a good understanding of the stakeholder, of their intent, and what they're looking to drive towards. We apply all those kind of good Agile principles that we know and love. And we focus on building a relationship with what is a key stakeholder and someone that has a particular outcome they want to achieve that is also important to us in terms of our organisation and the products and services that we deliver. So, from my perspective, very much we should be looking at Agile to help us solve some of these problems rather than seeing Agile as a barrier to achieving this. So, hope you've enjoyed hearing some of those points. Happy to discuss that in more detail over beer or otherwise. If anyone has any questions now, happy to take them, or I'm going to be here for some time we can network.
Hi, yes, so I know she mentioned Scrum a lot, and Sullivan and Schwaber would say Scrum is Scrum, right? After every Scrum iteration sprint, don't say you've got a ship, potentially shipping you have to have it ready to ship. You seem to have hardening sprints and preparation sprints. So how's that Scrum?
So I don't always like the purist approach. So I know Ken Schwaber would say all you need is Scrum, and actually for scaling Agile, all you need is Scrum. The reality is, in the real world, I think you need to do sometimes a little bit more than that. You need to kind of put a little bit more, sadly, put a little bit more ceremony and process around that. Now, I'd love it if you didn't have to do hardening sprints and release sprints, if you were ready to go at the end of every sprint. But if you're doing a big change or you've got a very large MVP, you're not necessarily going to be in a position to go live with something at the end of every sprint. So I'm on the side of, adopt all the principles of Scrum, but sometimes you need to do a little bit more.
So you're talking about some other Scrum?
It comes from Scaled Agile.
It's more what's Scaled Agile? What's purism, right? These are all, to me, excuses for not doing it properly, right? And that's well known in the Agile community. So actually, it's not pragmatic. Pragmatic is doing it properly, because you can do all of that, and I work in regulatory work in that real-time regulatory environment, and we do it. So you can do this stuff. So I don't understand why it's a purist approach to do it properly.
I understand what you're saying, and I'm really pleased to hear that you can adopt Scrum in that way and you can do everything in that way. My experience is that in a number of projects and environments, you can't always do it exactly by the book in terms of Scrum, and that's where I think other methodologies like disciplined agile delivery, scaled agile framework and things come into their own and add a bit something extra around that. So I don't think there's a... My experience kind of delivering software for 20 years is there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach, and I don't think saying it's either textbook Scrum or it's nothing, I don't think that's practical in the real world.
That's fine, but then don't call it Scrum if it's not Scrum, right? Okay. Tell us what it is.
I'm happy to take that on board, yeah, absolutely.
I think, I mean, on that, I think in a sense, like, I guess I'm probably the more pragmatic end of stuff as well. So I suppose I don't get too involved whether it's Scrum or not. But I think certainly in terms of release frequency, I'm with you. I guess the show of hands here showed common practice isn't to release every sprint, but I wish it was, or even more often. So I think.
Okay, well, let's expand it further. You go to the principles page on the Agile Principles site. It says if you don't release within 2 months, then you're not doing Agile. So 3-month delivery, not Agile. According to the Agile Manifesto, you go to principles site. So already, within releases above that, we're doing Scrum, we just have big MVPs, not Agile. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess we're sort of.
So you have to tell me what you're doing. You're not doing Agile, you're not doing Scrum.
Can I ask a different question?
Yeah.
Sorry, but it's just I'll add up that. So my background is kind of in banking, yeah, and now it's in training guys like young graduates, yeah. So and more of the kind of start-uppy world, yeah. So it's naturally a better fit for Agile, yeah. But what I'm interested in, what was interesting for me on this talk was about the customer, which is the regulatory person in the banking world, and involving that person more. Yeah, I'm just interested to know a little bit more around that. How does that work in a bank? Do you get the external regulatory person in, or is there a regulatory team within the bank who helps with that? And how do they fit into your core dev team?
I think both. I mean, typically we normally see internal folk, and certainly have teams with lawyers on the call and stuff, and that I guess can be pleasant or not. I guess certainly I've had feedback from people that talk with regulators that say they're really open to discussing stuff. I think particularly they're open to discussing projects that probably are at the sort of uncompliant end of things that we should be doing.
So do you have then, there's an understanding within the team, because what it seems to me is you've got the external sort of date where the regulatory work has to be done by, and then you've got the team that you're talking about. What are the communication problems between that external point, the regulatory team within the bank, and the core dev team? How does that sort of help to be tied together with this methodology?
I think there's no sort of magic behind that. It's a lot of lots of calls with lots of people getting involved. I think depending on the type of regulation, sometimes in-house compliance teams don't really understand the regulation that well. They act sort of more as kind of project managers to say, project team, have you abided by this regulation? I think equally cases where they understand it exceptionally well and they are really the subject matter experts. I think it depends on which of those situations you're in, and I suppose also how black and white the regulation is. So some regulations are pretty clear, some's super open to interpretation.
Yeah, because I thought it was really interesting, so I'm just wondering how you improve that. And also this idea, I like the idea of having that external team almost being, instead of a kind of, that's okay now, it's more of a sort of checklist thing.
Yeah, I think it'd be great to meet with that sort of world, but you have to build that trust, they have to know that you know what you're doing.
My question is that when you have to split in stories or in epics something that it's basically coming from a regulator, how do you create the empathy with the person able to explain to the product owner and to the team how to properly split in order to perfectly understand the epic and the story? Because from from my point of view, the regulatory world is sometimes awkward and sometimes illogical. So it's interesting. And the second question is, ever happened that creating the story together, the regulator stopped himself for a while and said, oh, you're right. It's better if we do this way. It's better if we change our internal rule because your suggestions are more compliant to the real world.
I guess my first answer to that is often it isn't that different from dealing with any sort of clients or product owner. A lot of product owners find it hard to write ethics and stories that actually able to build them straight away. I'm not sure.
Some practical cases.
Yeah, I'm not sure about practical example. I mean, I guess what I'm thinking is very much around that outcome. So, what's the outcome that the regulator's looking to achieve? What is it they're looking to check? And actually, I think it seems to be within the regulation environment, it's moving more to kind of descriptive outcomes rather than prescriptive processes. So I think largely think of the regulation as an external kind of stakeholder, but then when it comes to that, the product owner helping you actually, this is what that means in the context of our organisation, in the context of our service, and how we're going to decompose that into the stories. So I think that's probably the approach I would take at a theoretical level. As for examples of that, I'm struggling a little bit, but that's the approach I would take. If the stakeholder has an outcome that they want to achieve, actually how that's achieved is probably more down to the internal team and the organisation.
Thank you.
I have several questions, but I just go for two. What are you using to spin up the environments? Which technology are you using? If you are doing it.
Essentially all sorts of technology. So we're a consultancy, we're a pretty tech agnostic consultancy, so we work with tech our clients work with or recommend what are the best, so essentially everything. I guess we've got a bit more experience with Azure probably. Everything, so very much project specific, I'm afraid.
Do you know Docker?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you recommend it?
Yeah, I think we're only really starting to see. I guess we work with some pretty conservative clients, perhaps, but we're really starting to see. Well, we're definitely starting to see interest from a while ago. I think we're only really starting to see people using it in a big way now. That might be more our client base. But yeah, we've definitely got projects on the go using Docker.
Okay.
I think that whole infrastructure automation, is I think a massive thing, but also something that poses some challenges when you come to want to accredit something.
Okay. And the second one is about the definition of ready. So you are managing like having external requirements, and imagine that someone is saying to you, you need to do this in 1 month, but the requirements are not there, but you need to do it.
Yeah,
How do you manage it?
one of my colleagues who worked in a hedge fund, he said there were sort of examples of regulation where the deadline came and then a bit later they explained what they meant, which is really hard to do.
Welcome in Italy.
Yeah.
It works like that every time.
Sorry, I forgot the question actually.
How you are managing the definition of ready? You are able to go to these people and say, no, we are not including this in the sprint because our definition of ready.
Well, I think that very much depends on the team.
If you can do this, congratulations.
Yeah, I think that depends on the team and how confident they're feeling, but I guess I'm sure there's plenty of examples where we haven't.
So the question is, if you have a definition of ready, if you are applying it.
Not a standard one.
Changes project by project, probably.
Sorry?
Changes project by project.
Yeah, it does change project by project, and also who you're dealing with as well. I think some product owners really get it, and you can be very strict with them. Some you need to help more because they haven't done it before, and you need to be a bit more helpful.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the definition of ready is an interesting one, isn't it? In terms of how you judge that, and is a story negotiable and all those kind of things, and is it actually ready to go? Again, I'll go back to the answer earlier around the kind of outcome that the regulator wants. So that's around your backlog grooming and taking the stories in that are ready to go. acknowledging that there's an accumulation of a large number of stories probably that go to make the outcome that the regulator is seeking to achieve.
I have a couple of more, but if we can.
Yeah, we'll move on.
Thank you, first of all, for giving your insights in this regulated environment. My question is actually a very helicopter view of things. You talk about in the market, companies are saying that they're quite customer-centric and they design their softwares and products according to the customer requirements and whatever they want. So if you talk about having an agile sort of a system within the company where you're releasing your software by sprint or maybe after a month, and you build those use cases according to the customer requirements, maybe coming from the CRM team or sort of that, and the use cases are not compliant with the regulatory environment. I mean, how would you think of going? Would you think whether you should go with the regulator, or you would make your software more customer centric? And how Agile can actually sort of act in the way, like behaving in a more regulated environment? Would you be more towards revenue earning, or would you be more towards sort of being more compliant with the regulators?
I guess there's a fairly simple and flippant answer, which is you're generally looking at delivering systems to meet user needs, but you don't do everything that they use. It's not about user wants, it's about user needs, and it's not actually about what user needs.
It's
about user needs that generate business value, because at the end of the day, the only reason any of us deliver products and services for our organisation is to generate value for the organisation. Now, if that means implementing a user need that isn't compliant, that doesn't generate any value for the organisation because of the risk associated with that. So it fails that basic test really, and that's basically how I judge it. Where's the value? So I'd turn it back into not a kind of user need kind of conversation, but a business value conversation. So there might be value there, because people might buy it, but if we're not compliant in selling it, we're going to get shut down. So it's a simple kind of business value conversation from my perspective.
Totally agree with that. As a counterjection to that, if you talk about economics, you're not completely reaching your profit margin if you sort of go with that thing. I mean, how do you reach your break-even point when you talk about meeting up your budget for a year? I mean, filling up your balance sheet. I mean, how would you justify it to your shareholders if you're not meeting up your profit margin? Say, for example, for a quarter.
Well, I think that's a much broader business question. But I certainly don't know any shareholders that would be happy with a product team taking the decision to breach compliance. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Again, thank you very much. I work for a company that does a lot of business internationally. Usually we'll have us, a partner in country, and then a local national regulator. And in that case, you're not necessarily directly linked to the regulator, you'll be going through your trusted partner. And I was wondering if you had an experience of working in that environment or applying Agile in an environment of that style.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in a sense, yes, lots of experience like that. We do a lot of work in Scandinavia and further afield. I think generally we rely on the people we're working for to have those relationships. And I guess partly due to our client base, they tend to have those relationships already, and it's their business relationships. So I suppose, yes, I'm not sure. I guess I'm not sure I have anything particularly insightful to say about it. I think you need some local knowledge, or you need to invest a fair bit of time. I mean, you can create those relationships, but it's just, I guess, hard for you as an insight.
Yeah, I think Illustrated is kind of a complex ecosystem that we work within, and having a very broad and diverse stakeholder community, and it's how you manage that stakeholder community, and indeed, not that different to the challenge having delivering any kind of product internationally, where you've got to meet the needs of local markets and individual requirements, and tailoring those requirements to different local markets. So it is that challenge, and I'm not saying it's straightforward, but I think it's around kind of getting closer to those individual stakeholders in those local markets.
I realise it was quite a vague question, so I'll try and make it more specific. The problem we find is that we get driven towards a more waterfall style of approach because our partners don't want to have to go through essentially that constant iterative process. We have a contract, they expect a big bang. Is there any way would you suggest negotiating around that and trying to negotiate them towards a more agile framework, or improving the way that the company does it internally?
There's a number of ways you can approach that. I mean, my natural inclination is to do it agile anyway, and to do what you can to rehearse the compliance, and then deal with the regulator who won't bend to that, and do the compliance ones with them. So I'd still use agile internally, even though the stakeholder won't engage in that way, because I still think there's benefits for you as an organisation in doing that and rehearsing that compliance and building that compliance incrementally. So you might need a proxy for the regulator internally to help you achieve that, but I still think there's a lot of value in working with agile even when that external stakeholder doesn't recognise that process.
I guess my question kind of relates to that. Our experience with financial services has been that they expect quite a rigid delivery, all in one go. So our iterative approach has generally been the feature switches, and effectively it would be implemented, switched off, but we could work on the environment. And I'd be interested as to your views whether that would be deemed a success or not. But also be interested to sort of for you to expand on examples of when you have been able to work intricately with the regulator.
I guess
that's the mic.
First of all, I think feature switches are awesome. Actually, I think they're a really, really underused tool for frequent deliveries. So I'd say, in a sense, that's kind of successful. I suppose it depends if you're releasing every 2 weeks and then you're actually turning it all on a year later. That does have some limitations. So I suppose one of the ways we've seen feature switches used really well is to give kind of friendly users first sight of stuff. I suppose from a compliance point of view that might not be quite possible. But you can certainly mitigate the risk by doing that. In terms of, I guess, actual work, I suppose it depends on what area of regulation and compliance you're dealing with. I mean, some is, you have some sort of regulatory concerns where it's, you need to build this thing, and until you've built all that thing, you can't release it. It's not compliant. So in that case, you really, I'd still say release it, even if it's internally, iteratively. But until you've got it all, you can't release it publicly, and you're sort of a bit stuck there. It might be that you want to build something else, and until you've built all the extra bits to it, you're not compliant, and you come with some condition. So it kind of depends on what exactly it is. It's a bit vague, I guess.
Hi guys, can you hear me from over here?
Yeah.
Oh, fantastic. So thank you very much. Great talk. I think you're absolutely right about a lot of key points. And one of the key things was mentioned was the regulator as a customer. I don't see the regulator as a customer, I see them as a constraint on the product that you're trying to push out. So one of the advantages of Agile is obviously embracing change. So as a company, at what point do you introduce the regulator? How do you ensure that change is actually compliant? Do you have a compliance team internally within your organisation? Or do you ensure that the requirement gets sent to the regulator? Or do you have your developers understand what those constraints are? And how would you then take that from the consultancy model and apply that to small startups who are obviously very resource constrained?
Great question.
I think, I guess to some extent we've been fortunate in that most of our clients are pretty big and have their own teams or mechanisms to deal with this. So I think the answer is kind of all of those, depending on who it is. I think some of our clients have a good relationship with regulators and will I guess be involved in discussions with them. Some we just deal with in-house lawyers and compliance teams and don't not even really sure how much of a relationship they have with the regulator. So I think kind of the general answer is quite hard there, but probably all of those.
So with a small startup, say you're a startup, most startups got 5, 10, 20 people, right? Most of them are lucky if they've even got a relationship with a lawyer, let alone internal compliance team. They may not even heard of the FCA. How would you recommend them go and follow the Agile process and ensure that what they do, for example, in the fintech space or the regtech space or insurtech space, is compliant, given most of them have never read, for example, any of the regulatory handbooks and are all pretty much involved in financial promotions or anything in the realm where they can probably get arrested, sued, or any of the other fun stuff that can happen to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a challenge because you're resource constrained. There's potentially a lot of material to get through and understand and digest and to get onto your backlog. You may have just spotted a very interesting business opportunity for someone to advise fintechs on regulation, I think is the answer.
Okay, no problem. I mean, one suggestion obviously is to use the FCA. They've got the sandbox now, so you can actually get involved and get early advice, right? But, cool.
We're running out of time, so we're going to allow 2 more questions, if that's okay.
There's one at the back at the bar.
Yeah. From your... Mine's a really quick one, all right? Okay. You mentioned a minute ago that you've sometimes seen guys who've got a really good relationship with regulators and are talking really regularly with a regulatory body. Have you ever seen a regulatory body start to learn some stuff about how they should be a bit more agile in setting regulations by working with an agile delivery team?
I'm not sure exactly that. I've certainly seen, I guess I'm thinking of one client in particular who's quite active in their region, and I've certainly seen the regulator, I guess, have a good relationship with them, and I think I'm particularly thinking their regulations tend to be fairly open to interpretation. And I think this client has really helped them understand and kind of produce some of the sort of reference implementations of things. So I'm not sure, I don't know about Agile, but I think certainly flexibility. I've seen.
Last question at the back.
From your experience, are the regulatory bodies, are they willing to get involved pre-production? So say you have a UAT release, would they be willing to have a look at what you've done at that point, just to verify if you're compliant?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm aware of certainly a couple of clients where the expectation was that, and I think the practice was that they'd get involved from the design stage, so they'd see, I guess some of these things were sort of more consumer-focused regulation, like what you could do in the system, and they were happy to look at designs for things to say, is this fitting the regulations for what you can do with this segment of customers. So yeah, absolutely from really super early stages, I think. I guess it depends on the body.
Okay,
Thanks
very much, guys.
Yeah, thanks very much to Rob and Nigel for that. That was really great. Absolutely loved the questions as well. They're going to be hanging around for a while, so if you want to continue the debate, we'll probably have to cut the debating off at 9 and then only talk about other things. It's good to see that so many topics are so important to so many of you. In terms of the Agile Roundabout, we have our August meetup a week earlier on the 18th, I think it is. The 18th, it's a talk on Kanban by someone from ASOS called Helen Meek. So it'd be great to see as many of you here there. And also, if you have, we really want to try and continue improving this meetup group. This is only our second. We're going to run it every month, and we have hosts lined up until February now, which is great. But if anybody has any feedback for us or suggestions about how we can improve it, that would be wonderful. Just email us or whack it on the meetup group, that would be great. It's going to be this sort of style running right through to February, apart from December, where Frank is going to run a Christmas Agile quiz for us from Frank from GameSys, which is fantastic. But other than that, I just want to thank all of you for coming tonight, and we'll be hanging around till a little bit later. The cut-off point at the bar is about 9 o'clock, so get your beers in, then wines, and then we may go to the pub. So we'll see some of you around. Thank you very much.
Sorry.